War at sea has always fascinated the public, with its hulking battleships, stealthy submarines, and dramatic carrier strikes. But World War II completely rewrote the rules. In less than a decade, centuries-old doctrines collapsed under the weight of new technology, new tactics, and new thinking. Some strategies proved devastating, while others, once hailed as genius, ended in ruin. This is the story of the doctrines that shaped World War II's war at sea, and how the oceans of the 1940s became the proving ground for future conflicts. Flawed, decisive battle doctrine. In the early 20th century, the idea of naval supremacy rested on one belief, that wars at sea would be decided by a single, colossal showdown between battleship lines. This doctrine, fueled by Alfred Thayer Mahan's writings, dominated naval planning worldwide. Mahan argued that command of the sea came not from raids or blockades, but from crushing the enemy fleet in a single, decisive action. No navy embraced that logic more fervently than Imperial Japan. Its war plan, Kantai Kessen, or decisive battle, assumed the US Pacific Fleet would steam westward across the ocean, exposing itself to a staged ambush near Japanese-held waters. There, Japan's battleships, led by Yamato and Musashi, the largest ever built, would annihilate the enemy in a set-piece battle reminiscent of Tsushima. The flaw in that thinking became clear even before Pearl Harbor. In November 1940, outdated British Swordfish biplanes launched a night raid on the Italian port of Taranto, slipping past harbour defences and crippling 3 Italian battleships. The Japanese studied Taranto closely. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto even modelled the Pearl Harbor attack on its tactics. But despite the lesson, Japan still saw carriers as auxiliaries, useful for scouting or softening the enemy line, but not as the main event. The theory shattered in 1942. At the Battle of the Coral Sea, and more decisively at Midway, rival fleets never came within gun range. Aircraft launched from over the horizon found and sank ships the crews never saw. Yamato's mighty 18.1-inch guns were irrelevant when air power was able to strike targets hundreds of kilometers away. While the Pacific campaign raged on, Japan's prized super battleships sat mostly idle, too valuable to risk, awaiting the epic clash that Japanese planners envisioned. Their long-awaited engagement came at Leyte Gulf in October 1944. But American radar, air power, and carrier coordination proved decisive. Musashi was sunk by airstrikes before she ever engaged US surface ships. Yamato turned back after a heroic stand by outgunned US forces. Historian Evan Maudsley argues that the deployment of Yamato and Musashi in 1944-45 exemplified a dying doctrine, an attempt to use battleships as decisive surface ships when everything learned in war had moved toward carrier and air power. Technology had moved on. Submarines stalked battleship formations undetected. Carrier aircraft could strike from hundreds of miles away. The iconic broadside duels, once considered the pinnacle of warfare on the seas, barely even had a chance to take place. Economics delivered the final verdict. For the cost of one Yamato, Japan could have produced dozens of aircraft, escorts, or smaller carriers that would have been more useful to the war effort. US Admiral Ernest King famously said, "The battleship is still a useful weapon, but it's no longer the decisive weapon." Japan spent years and vast resources preparing for a battle that never occurred, tying down its most powerful ships in pursuit of fantasy. By the time those ships moved, the war had already left them behind. It remains one of the most expensive doctrinal misjudgments in naval history. Flawed, Kamikaze, and desperation tactics. By late 1944, Japan's navy was a shell of its former self. It had lost most of its carrier force, its elite pilots mostly dead, and its surface fleet outmatched by an American war machine that launched more ships, more planes, and more trained aviators every month. With no viable way to contest US air or sea dominance, Tokyo turned to a doctrine of last resort, tokotai, or special attack units, what the West came to call the Kamikaze. The premise was as brutal as it was simple. Load a plane with explosives, put a pilot in the cockpit, and fly it directly into an allied ship. They surmised that a poorly trained pilot in a slow, outdated plane could do catastrophic damage if the plane was properly guided toward the target. All the pilot needed to do was learn how to take off, navigate, and fly the plane well enough to hit its mark. In theory, this allowed Japan to field more effective pilots faster, bypassing the need for extensive training since the mission required only one-way precision. The first massed kamikaze attacks came at the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944. For a moment, it seemed the concept worked. Hit rates were significantly higher than conventional bombing, and the damage wasn't insignificant. Escort carriers were destroyed, destroyers torn apart, and radar picket ships battered. But these tactical victories concealed a fatal strategic flaw. Kamikaze missions weren't sustainable. Japan lost nearly 4,000 pilots and over 2,600 aircraft in these attacks, losses it couldn't afford. Most of these men had only basic training, and many of them had been coerced or emotionally manipulated into volunteering. The United States, meanwhile, adapted quickly. Radar pickets extended warning time, combat air patrols flew continuous loops overhead, ships created layered anti-aircraft defenses with flak bursts and proximity fuses. Damage control improved too, allowing even heavily struck vehicles to stay afloat and return to port. British carriers, meanwhile, had armored decks, negating any damage caused. Kamikazes killed over 7,000 US sailors and damaged or sank more than 300 ships, but no landing was ever stopped and no fleet was turned back. By the time of Okinawa in 1945, kamikaze attacks had reached their peak, but so had their futility. The tactic became more frantic than focused. Even the mighty battleship Yamato was sent on a one-way suicide run with orders to beach herself and act as a coastal fortress. She never made it. US carrier planes sank her hours from the shore. The strategic impact of kamikazes was negligible. Historian Richard B. Frank characterizes the kamikaze campaign as Japan's ultimate admission that it had no strategic path to victory, only a way to die with honor. In retrospect, kamikaze warfare was desperation codified. It consumed irreplaceable lives and machines for shock value rather than operational leverage. And while it's remained one of the most remembered aspects of the Pacific War, its legacy is one of tragedy, not effectiveness. Flawed, fleet-in-being strategy. For centuries, navies feared what they could not find. A fleet didn't have to fight to shape the course of a war, it only had to exist. This was the logic behind the fleet-in-being doctrine, the idea that merely preserving a powerful naval force without committing it to battle could deter enemy action, force caution, and tie down vast resources. The concept traces back to the 17th century, but it gained prominence in the writings of naval theorist Alfred Thayer Mahan. He argued that sea power resided not just in presence but in potential. A fleet at anchor could still influence diplomacy, strategy, and logistics by threatening to strike. World War I only strengthened this line of thinking. The German High Seas Fleet seldom challenged the Royal Navy in open battle, but its very existence tied down a massive portion of the British Grand Fleet. Just by being there, it forced the Royal Navy to maintain a constant presence in the North Sea, hedging against the possibility of a breakout toward the English Channel. That meant fewer British ships could be spared for other theaters, such as the Mediterranean or the Pacific. But by the time of World War II, the doctrine was already showing its age. Advances in air power meant that a fleet could be attacked and severely damaged without ever leaving port. A battleship no longer had to sail into combat to be rendered useless. Airstrikes could cripple it at anchor. The threat of a fleet in being was no longer enough. It had to fight, and fighting now meant exposure to weapons its armor couldn't stop. Yet, many navies still clung to the old logic. Italy's modern battleships remained at anchor for much of the war, pinned down by the threat of British aircraft and submarines. Germany adopted a similar stance in the Atlantic. The battleships Tirpitz and Scharnhorst were rarely deployed aggressively after early raids. Instead, Tirpitz spent most of the war lurking in the Norwegian fjords, forcing the British to assign constant surveillance, air patrols, and convoy escorts to contain a ship that rarely moved. The doctrine had a logic, but it no longer worked in practice. Preserved fleets failed to deter action, all while becoming very juicy targets. Fixed naval assets could now be attacked from the air, mined from afar, or rendered irrelevant by flexible carrier strike groups and submarines. The cost was strategic paralysis. While battleships rusted at anchor, convoys were sunk, islands were taken, and supply lines were cut. Resources poured into maintenance, fuel, and shore defenses that delivered no return. Worst of all, nations pinned their hopes on fleets they were too afraid to lose, until they lost the war instead. The fleet in being doctrine might have made sense in an age of line-of-sight battles and limited surveillance, but by 1942, it was an echo from a vanished era, more psychological crutch than viable strategy. Flawed, commerce raiding doctrine. For centuries, commerce raiding was the go-to naval strategy for weaker powers. The idea was simple: don't fight the enemy's fleet head-on, instead, sink their merchant ships, disrupt their economy, and force them to spread their forces thin, trying to protect their trade routes. Privateers used it in the Age of Sail, Confederate raiders did it in the American Civil War, and Germany implemented it in World War I when outmatched by the Royal Navy. But by World War II, the nature of naval warfare had changed, making the doctrine far less effective. Germany was the main proponent in the early years of the war. With a small surface fleet, the Kriegsmarine deployed long-range ships like Admiral Graf Spee and Admiral Scheer, along with disguised merchant raiders such as Cormoran. Their mission was to avoid direct engagements and instead pick off Allied shipping across the Atlantic and Indian Oceans. And early on, they had some success. Graf Spee sank 9 merchant ships before being cornered in Montevideo. Cormoran famously sank the Australian cruiser HMAS Sydney, though both ships were lost in the process. These successes, however, were short-lived. By 1941, the Allies had reintroduced convoys with armed escorts, expanded the use of patrol craft, and developed radar and radio direction finding technology to track enemy movements. Without friendly overseas bases or secure refueling points, German surface raiders were increasingly isolated and vulnerable. Most of them were hunted down before they could do lasting damage. More importantly, the strategic impact never matched the effort. Surface raiders, while occasionally successful, couldn't sink ships fast enough to overwhelm Allied shipbuilding capacity. For every ship sunk, the Allies built more, especially after the US entered the war. In theory, commerce raiding was still sound. It forced the Allies to guard their convoys and spread their resources, but in practice, it wasn't enough. It didn't protect Axis supply lines, it didn't threaten Allied naval dominance, and it couldn't alter the strategic picture. By the mid-war period, commerce raiding by surface ships had largely disappeared. In a global, industrial war where air power, code breaking, and production mattered more than ever, commerce raiding was a 19th century solution trying to survive in a 20th century fight. Effective. Wolfpack U-boat campaign. In the early years of World War II, the German U-boat campaign came dangerously close to severing Britain's Atlantic lifeline. The key to this threat was the Wolfpack doctrine, a coordinated strategy that turned submarines into a highly potent strike package. Rather than patrolling independently, U-boats operated in dispersed patrol lines across the projected path of Allied convoys. When one boat made contact, it would shadow the target, report its position, and summon nearby submarines via encrypted radio. Once the pack assembled, they attacked en masse, often at night and on the surface, where U-boats had the speed and maneuverability advantage. The pack was usually around 8 to 15 U-boats strong. The method was terrifyingly effective. In the first phase of the campaign, what German crews called the First Happy Time, U-boats prowled the North Atlantic with near impunity. Between mid-1940 and early 1941, more than 1,300 Allied ships were sunk. For Britain, an island dependent on imports, the implications were dire. In November 1940 alone, U-boats sank 33 ships, totaling over 171,000 gross registered tons. The situation worsened when the United States entered the war. In early 1942, German submarines exploited America's failure to implement a coastal convoy system, launching Operation Paukenschlag, or Drumbeat. U-boats prowled within sight of East Coast cities, sinking tankers and freighters, silhouetted against city lights. German submariners dubbed it the second happy time. One of the most infamous demonstrations of Wolfpack effectiveness came in March 1943. Convoys HX-229 and SC-122 were ambushed by 39 U-boats operating under Admiral Karl Dönitz's Befehlshaber der Unterseeboote command. Over the course of 4 brutal days, the submarines sank 22 ships, totaling more than 140,000 tons. Convoy Commodore reports from HX-229 describe torpedo strikes every quarter hour, with escorts stretched to the limit and air cover non-existent. Royal Navy historian Stephen Roskill later concluded the Germans never came so near to disrupting communications between the New World and the Old as in the first 20 days of March 1943. Elsewhere, Wolfpacks were employed on a smaller scale. In the Arctic, U-boats attacked Allied convoys bound for the Soviet Union, such as PQ-17 and PQ-18, though ice, narrow sea lanes, and frequent air cover made operations difficult. Interestingly, the United States adopted a similar approach in the Pacific, where its submarine force targeted Japanese merchant shipping. Beginning in 1943, American subs operated in coordinated attack groups, typically 3 boats working under a senior officer. Unlike the German method, which relied on central direction from headquarters in France, US subs were more autonomous, coordinating attacks on the fly. One notable example came in July 1944, when USS Pachi, Steelhead, and Hammerhead attacked a Japanese convoy off Formosa. In a coordinated night action, they sank 5 ships and damaged several more. Commander Lawson P. Red Ramage of the Pachi was awarded the Medal of Honor for remaining on the surface during a torpedo run and maneuvering through the convoy under fire. These American Wolfpacks weren't as large or centralized as the German ones, but they achieved devastating results. By the war's end, US submarines had sunk over 60% of Japan's merchant fleet. Still, the original German doctrine had limits. Wolfpacks relied on radio transmissions for coordination, making them vulnerable to Allied radio direction finding, HF/DF or HFDF. British and American cryptanalysts also began breaking key segments of the German naval Enigma code. This information, codenamed Ultra, allowed Allied convoys to be rerouted away from known U-boat patrol lines, or even reinforced and used as bait to ambush the attackers. As Allied capabilities improved, the ocean itself became hostile to U-boats. Aircraft like the B-24 Liberators closed the mid-Atlantic gap. Escort carriers provided round-the-clock air cover. New weapons like the Hedgehog mortar offered forward-firing anti-submarine capability. The tipping point came in May 1943, Black May. Germany lost 43 U-boats in a single month. Allied losses had fallen dramatically. The cost was no longer sustainable, and Dönitz ordered a general withdrawal from the North Atlantic. But the legacy of the Wolfpack doctrine endured. It forced the Allies to develop one of the most complex anti-submarine warfare ecosystems in history, integrating intelligence, air power, escort ships, and advanced sensors. Churchill later wrote, "The only thing that ever really frightened me during the war was the U-boat peril." Ultimately, the Wolfpack campaign failed to isolate Britain or win the war for Germany. But in strategic terms, it came closer than any other Axis naval strategy. It demonstrated how a numerically inferior force could disrupt logistics and threaten the starvation of its adversary. Even in failure, it reshaped naval doctrine. Submarines would never again be seen as lone hunters, and the Allies' response to the Wolfpack threat laid the groundwork for Cold War anti-submarine warfare, where lessons from the Atlantic struggles proved valuable. Effective, Allied convoy doctrine and hunter-killer groups. In the early years of World War II, the greatest threat to Allied logistics was the German U-boat, as we've established. Between 1939 and 1942, these submarines sank thousands of merchant ships, cutting vital supply lines to Britain. There was no big fleet engagement to turn the tide, just a steady, brutal campaign of losses that threatened to starve Britain to submission. The turning point came not from any single battle, but from a doctrine, the convoy system, backed by layered, mobile anti-submarine warfare. Convoys weren't new. They had been used to great effect during World War II, but in 1939, many naval planners remained skeptical. Bundling dozens of slow merchant ships together, they feared, would simply create easier targets. In reality, the opposite was true. Grouping ships into convoys allowed the Allies to protect many vessels with a small number of escorts. The system turned hundreds of scattered targets into one moving fortress. At first, convoy protection was reactive. Escorts would defend their charges as best they could, using ASDIC, an early version of sonar and depth charges to fend off submarines. But as losses mounted, it became clear that defense alone wasn't enough. The Allies needed to go on the offensive. That's where hunter-killer groups came in. Built around escort carriers like USS Bogue and USS Card, these were free-roaming task forces designed to seek out and destroy U-boats before an attack could begin. Escort carriers carried 20 to 30 aircraft, usually a mix of torpedo bombers and patrol planes. These aircraft, armed with depth charges, radar, and acoustic torpedoes, scanned the seas for signs of submarines. Once a U-boat was spotted, nearby destroyers would close in using sonar and unleash depth charge patterns or forward-firing hedgehog mortars. Supporting them were Allied codebreakers, who, having cracked key portions of the German naval Enigma code, could now intercept and decipher U-boat orders. With the help from Huff-Duff direction-finding gear, hunter-killer groups could triangulate U-boat locations from intercepted radio traffic and be dispatched to choke points or intercept patrol lines. By mid-1943, the results spoke for themselves. German submarines that had once terrorized convoys were now being hunted and sunk in increasing numbers. In May 1943, Black May, Germany lost 43 submarines in a single month. Entire Wolfpacks were destroyed or scattered before they could launch a coordinated strike. The convoy system had bought time, and the hunter-killer groups took back the initiative. Convoy battles like HX-229, SC-122, and ONS-5 showed this shift in action. In March 1943, U-boats inflicted severe damage on the former, but at an increasing cost. A month later, during ONS-5, Allied escorts sank or crippled more than a dozen submarines. Importantly, this doctrine scaled. What began in the North Atlantic soon spread to the Arctic convoys, to Murmansk, to the South Atlantic, and to the Mediterranean. Escort carriers and sub-hunting destroyer groups operated in every theater. Even in the Pacific, hunter-killer formations were used by the US Navy to hunt down Japanese submarines, especially around the Philippines and the Marianas. Of course, these systems weren't flawless. Convoys could still be attacked, escort carriers were vulnerable to bad weather and couldn't absorb hits like fleet carriers, and success relied on a functioning intelligence pipeline. Without radio intercepts or decrypted traffic, the hunter-killer groups lost much of their edge. But with these elements in place, the Allies had finally turned the tide. By 1944, the combination of convoy doctrine and proactive ASW had transformed the Atlantic from a killing ground into a gauntlet, one that U-boats now struggled to survive. German submarines that once roamed freely now operated cautiously, often alone, and with ever-decreasing effectiveness. Allied shipping losses plummeted. Supply lines to Britain, the Soviet Union, and North Africa remained open, and the U-boat campaign never truly recovered. Perhaps most telling is what came next. The hunter-killer concept, carrier-based ASW groups backed by signals intelligence and rapid response destroyers, became a cornerstone of Cold War naval doctrine, showing a long-term shift in how navies thought about undersea warfare. The convoy doctrine and the hunter-killer groups that supported it solved the most dangerous naval threat of the war with methodical, scalable, and relentlessly effective operations. In terms of strategic impact, few doctrines did more with less. Devastating aircraft carrier warfare. For decades, the battleship was the apex of naval power, an ironclad embodiment of naval strength. Naval doctrine revolved around massive ships trading heavy gunfire in decisive, close-range encounters. But by the end of World War II, that model was obsolete. Aircraft carriers had redefined sea power, proving that air supremacy, not armor or gunnery, now determined who ruled the oceans. Japan showed the world just how game-changing this doctrine is. On December 7, 1941, 6 aircraft carriers from the Imperial Japanese Navy's Kirobutai launched a coordinated aerial strike on Pearl Harbor. In under 2 hours, they crippled the US Pacific Fleet without a single battleship firing a shell. The battleship, long regarded as the centerpiece of fleet strategy, had been outclassed before it could respond. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of the raid, reportedly warned before the war, "The fiercest serpent may be overcome by a swarm of ants." His swarm was carrier aircraft, which bypassed fleet gunnery and struck from over the horizon. Early Pacific campaigns reinforced the new paradigm. At the Battle of the Coral Sea, US and Japanese carriers fought without their fleets ever sighting one another. The first time a battle was fought that way. The battle was tactically inconclusive, but it introduced a new kind of naval warfare, one defined by aircraft range and flight deck operations. A month later, at Midway, US carrier dive bombers sank 4 Japanese fleet carriers in minutes, gutting Japan's elite naval aviation arm and handing the strategic initiative to the United States, all while the fleet stayed hundreds of miles apart. This paradigm shift rewrote how navies structured themselves. The US Navy reorganized its operational doctrine around carrier-led fleets. Central to this shift was the creation of the Fast Carrier Task Force, known by designations such as Task Force 58, under Admiral Mark Mitcher, and Task Force 38, under Admiral William Halsey. Comprised of multiple fleet and escort carriers protected by destroyers, cruisers, and battleships repurposed for anti-aircraft cover, they formed an integrated and mobile strike system, forming the tip of the spear for the US Navy in the Pacific. Throughout 1943 and 1944, the US launched a massive shipbuilding campaign. The Essex-class carrier became the workhorse of the Pacific Fleet. 17 were commissioned before war's end, each capable of hosting more aircraft than Japan's pre-war carriers. Carrier task forces dismantled Japan's entire war infrastructure. Planes launched from carrier decks bombed shore installations, fuel depots, airfields, and rail lines. They supported amphibious assaults at Tarawa, Saipan, Peleliu, Iwo and Okinawa, providing close air support and battlefield interdiction. The results were staggering. At the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, US pilots downed over 450 Japanese aircraft in a single day. The lopsided exchange became known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Carrier warfare also broke the back of Japan's ability to reinforce its garrisons. In 1945, as Task Force 58 loomed off the Japanese home islands, US planes conducted daily raids with near total impunity. And the carrier doctrine's strategic payoff wasn't limited to the Pacific. In the Atlantic, escort carriers, smaller vessels based on converted merchant hulls, were used to great effect. Their aircraft hunted U-boats, scouted convoys, and provided critical ASW coverage. Indeed, even when battleships saw action, like during the surface engagement off Samar in the Battle of Leyte Gulf, it was carrier aircraft that shaped the overall campaign. The Yamato and Musashi, the largest battleships ever built, were rendered ineffective or sunk long before their main guns fired in a proper duel. US airstrikes did what enemy dreadnoughts would have never been able to do. Carrier warfare did have its challenges though. The doctrine demanded tight coordination, constant refueling, and a massive logistics chain. Fleet oilers, ammunition ships, and repair vessels had to keep pace across thousands of miles. By the end of the war, the aircraft carrier had replaced the battleship as the central pillar of naval power. Every major navy took note. The Royal Navy accelerated its own carrier modernization, the Soviets began investing in aircraft carrying cruisers, and the US Navy retained its carrier-centric doctrine into the Cold War, and even now, with US strikes in the Middle East largely coming from carrier strike groups. Carrier warfare during World War II was transformative. It rewrote the rules of naval combat, overturned the assumptions of an entire generation of admirals, and gave the Allies unmatched operational depth. It allowed commanders to wage strategic warfare from the sea at a scale that the old gun lines could never match. Devastating. Complete blockade. Naval warfare has never just been about battles. Sometimes, the most powerful weapon isn't a ship or a plane, but a slow chokehold. The blockade, the deliberate maritime isolation of an enemy, was a centuries-old strategy made brutally effective in World War II, and nowhere was it more thoroughly applied than in the Pacific against Japan. This strategy wasn't new. From Sparta's naval blockade of grain shipments to Athens during the Peloponnesian War to Britain's blockade of Germany in World War I, using naval power to isolate and starve an enemy has long been a military strategy. The 1914-18 blockade had devastated Germany's civilian population, causing an estimated 400,000 deaths from malnutrition and disease. That precedent wasn't forgotten. In World War II, the scale and reach of maritime siege expanded like never before. It became a total campaign, one that blurred the line between military and economic targets. For the United States, especially after 1943, one of their aims was the strangling of Japan into submission by severing its access to fuel, food, raw materials, and reinforcements. The goal wasn't to win one big naval battle, it was to make every battle after that unnecessary. Japan's war machine was heavily dependent on imported resources. Oil from the Dutch East Indies, rubber from Southeast Asia, rice from Indochina, and iron ore from China and Korea. The American strategy focused on cutting these arteries. This was the essence of a blockade: destroy the logistics and the front collapses on its own. Submarines played a leading role. US Navy boats waged an aggressive commerce raiding campaign, one of the few times the US embraced unrestricted submarine warfare. By war's end, American subs had sunk over 1,300 Japanese merchant vessels, amounting to roughly 5 million tons of shipping. As Fleet Admiral Chester Nimitz wrote in his post-war report to the Secretary of the Navy, "Our submarines sank 55% of all Japanese ships lost during the war and 28% of Japanese warships. This small force, comprising less than 2% of the Navy, proved devastating." But submarines weren't acting alone. The blockade involved layers of pressure. Carrier strikes destroyed convoys and port facilities. Land-based bombers flying from newly captured airfields extended the reach even further, bombing oil depots in Palembang, refineries in Formosa, and rail yards in Kyushu. Air power, launched from land and sea, bombed infrastructure nodes like bridges, rail hubs, and oil refineries. Naval mines choked off harbors and channels. Amphibious island-hopping campaigns seized key choke points and airfields, turning vast swaths of ocean into no-go zones for Japanese shipping. The result was cumulative. Japan's merchant fleet, already inadequate by 1941, was decimated by 1944. Oil shipments from the southern resource zone dropped by over 90%. Food shortages became severe. Civilian caloric intake plummeted to as low as 1,500 calories per day in urban areas. The Japanese government resorted to rationing and recycled fuels. By early 1945, entire units in Manchuria and China were cut off, not by combat, but by lack of shipping. All of this was intentional. The Joint Chiefs of Staff had endorsed maritime blockade as a core element of Pacific strategy. The objective was to bleed Japan's economy and military over time. The doctrine of the blockade was slow, methodical, and devastating. Civilians suffered. Starvation became a creeping weapon. Strategic bombing campaigns complemented it, but it was the maritime isolation enabled by total US naval control that laid the foundation. And it worked. By mid-1945, Japan was effectively cut off from the outside world. Maritime traffic had collapsed. Fuel reserves were depleted. Troop reinforcements were impossible. War industries slowed to a crawl as raw materials could no longer reach the factories. Even Japan's navy withered in port, unable to sortie for lack of fuel. The famed battleship Yamato, in her final suicidal sortie to Okinawa, had barely enough fuel to make the trip one way, and she never returned. Still, the strategy wasn't universally admired. Critics questioned the ethics of targeting food and civilian supply, but strategically, the blockade achieved what it set out to do. It nullified Japan's ability to wage war, broke the back of its logistics, and forced the government to contemplate surrender long before an invasion could begin. By 1945, the Japanese weren't using the sea at all. The blockade doctrine lacked the drama of Midway or the firepower of a carrier strike, but in strategic terms, it was devastating. It leveraged the full spectrum of naval power: submarines, airstrikes, amphibious conquest, mining, and information warfare to shut down a modern industrial nation without setting foot on its soil. After the war, concepts like maritime denial, choke point control, and unrestricted submarine warfare became essential tools in peacetime planning for wartime containment. By the end of World War II, naval doctrine had been turned inside out. The aircraft carrier replaced the battleship, while some of the most feared ships of the war never fired their guns. But none of this happened overnight. Each doctrine, flawed, effective, or devastating, was forged through trial, error, and enormous cost. Some navies adapted, while others didn't, and in that gap, entire fleets were lost and wars were won. But what do you think? Which of these doctrines do you think had the most impact? Could the battleship have remained relevant if deployed differently? Were kamikazes a last resort, or could they have changed the war if used earlier? And what are your thoughts on the blockade strategy? Let us know all that and more in the comments section below. And as always, guys, thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video.